Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a real puzzle today. How can a crisis in one tiny shipping lane cause a huge panic for cooking gas in India, while at the very same time the country's cars just kept on running like nothing was wrong?
So let's start with what was actually happening on the ground in India. It's this incredible story of two different fuels, both coming from the same part of the world, but creating two completely different realities for everyday people.
On one side, you had what looked like chaos. People waiting in these massive lines for liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG. You know, the gas that millions of us use for cooking. But then you look over at the petrol pumps, and it's just business as usual. Plenty of petrol and diesel for everyone.
And that brings us to the big question we're going to unpack. How is that even possible? How can two fuel supply chains, both with origins in the same region, behave so differently? One was super fragile, and the other totally resilient. Let's figure out why.
Okay, to get our answer, we have to zoom out a bit. We need to look at a really critical spot on the world map, a narrow strip of water that's become a major global flashpoint.
This is the Strait of Hormuz. You can really think of it as a vital artery for the world's energy. A huge amount of the planet's oil and gas has to get squeezed through this single, very narrow channel to reach the rest of us.
Now, recent conflict in the region has basically put a chokehold on this artery. And when there's a disruption here, it doesn't just stay local. It sends shockwaves across the globe, especially to countries like India that really depend on the energy flowing through that strait.
All right, let's start pulling this mystery apart. First things first, why on earth was the LPG supply so incredibly vulnerable?
Well, here's the heart of the problem. India uses a ton of LPG every year, over 31 million tons. But it only produces about half of what it needs. That means more than 50% of its entire supply has to be shipped in from other countries.
So where are these imports coming from? Mostly from these key Gulf countries. And you see the pattern here, right? All of them have to ship their cargo out through one and only one very specific route.
And this is the knockout punch. A staggering 80 to 90% of all that imported LPG has to navigate right through the Strait of Hormuz. It's an unbelievably fragile lifeline.
And this quote just nails it. Because basically everything was funneled through this one single point of failure. The very moment things got tight in Hormuz, the shockwave traveled directly to kitchens all across India.
Okay, so that explains the mess with LPG. But what about the other side of this story? Why was the supply of petrol and diesel so steady? Well, the answer is a really smart three-layered safety net.
See, unlike that fragile LPG lifeline, India's crude oil supply is protected by a really robust three-part defense system. Let's break down each layer.
So, layer number one, diversification. India gets its crude oil from over 40 different countries, so it's not putting all its eggs in one basket. What's really key here is that its top supplier is now Russia, and that oil comes in on routes that completely bypass the Strait of Hormuz.
And just look at how well that strategy works. A full 70% of crude imports now arrive from totally outside that danger zone. It just makes the whole supply chain so much less vulnerable to a crisis in any one spot.
Defense layer number two is all about domestic control. India doesn't just import ready-to-use petrol and diesel, it imports the raw crude oil and refines it right at home. This is huge because it gives the country the flexibility to switch between different types of crude from different suppliers if one route suddenly gets blocked.
And finally, the ultimate insurance policy. India has these enormous underground caverns, literally carved out of rock, that are filled with crude oil just for emergencies. These are the strategic reserves, and they can cover weeks of the country's needs, giving it a critical buffer against any sudden supply shock.
So what's the big takeaway from this whole tale of two fuels? What does it really teach us about the complex systems that power our everyday lives?
It really all comes down to this. LPG was vulnerable because it depended almost entirely on one fragile route. Crude oil, on the other hand, was strong because it was protected by this multi-layered system. Lots of different sources, control over refining, and a strategic backup plan. It's just a powerful reminder that these incredibly complex global supply chains are usually invisible to us, right up until they break. A conflict happening thousands of miles away can ripple across the world and have a direct impact on something as basic as cooking dinner for your family. And that really leaves us with a final, pretty important question to think about. This crisis showed us a hidden weakness in our kitchens. It really makes you wonder what other essential part of our daily lives is depending on a single fragile lifeline, just waiting for the next global shock.